Earlier this year, I commissioned Malleus Martialis to produce for me a Renaissance-styled longsword to use in sparring. And now that I've had this sword for a few weeks, it was time I gave it a proper review. Quick disclaimer before we get started, while I did pay for the sword itself, I did not pay the usual design fees that Malleus would charge for custom work like this. Instead, we arranged that I would review the sword and highlight some of their custom work. But the review will still be my own thoughts. I did pay for the sword, so there is that element as well. To start off, some specs. The entire sword is 52 inches long, and it has a blade length of 39.5 inches. According to my scale, it comes in at 4 pounds with a point of balance of 3¼ inch. The blade flexes after about 17.8 pounds of pressure. What this combines to give you is a longsword that is size-wise more or less on par with the standard fetters in the market, while being a bit on the heavier end. But we gotta remember that a lot of that weight isn't because it has a big chunky blade, but rather because it has all this ample hand protection that is often absent from other longswords. At this size and weight, it's a little unwieldy in one hand, but you can cheat it a little bit because we have these finger rings. By slipping a finger over the guard, you now have enough leverage that you can actually get something approaching a passable performance out of it in one hand. Certainly enough to try some cheeky one-handed cuts. Continuing on with what the guard can let you get away with is, yes, we can get a finger over the guard there, but that's not the only benefit we're getting from these projections. From those finger rings spout 2 more side ports in addition to the main side rings that we have further down. And with all 4 of these ports working together, you have a very secure hand that is quite difficult to reach. In my time using this in sparring, a lot of people I went up against just sort of gave up trying to land hand shots. Sometimes they'd get them in, especially if they could sneak in from below and target the backhand. But for the most part, this blocked enough incoming blows that it just wasn't worth trying, because if I could catch them on my guard, now that gave me the advantage. So it's a very well-protected hand from this guard configuration, and I can definitely tell why a lot of historical longswords, later on and towards the Renaissance and so on, took on these guards, because they just work. Now, as for how it behaves in 2 hands, it is very responsive for its weight and size, but it is not a light fetter. It is going to require you to work with it. You can't just Zvercopter spam this to victory. It's not that sword. You can't use it like that. I found that it behaves, for me, best in a sort of counter-punching kind of way. You have a degree of hand protection here that you can afford to camp out in long point positions in relative safety because of how hard your hands are to get at. So you can take these long positions, use your long blade length, and just sort of keep people at bay and work into openings as they appear, or catching and punishing them for their attacks against you. Again, the heft of it makes failures and other sorts of snap pull kind of feints a little hard to sell. You might get them convinced it's going to happen, but by the time you have pulled the sword back and re-accelerated it to the new direction, they have already moved and gone to parry it. It's not very forgiving in that sort of failure approach to fighting, but the weight and mass of this sword does give it a really tremendous bind presence when it comes crashing through. You can displace swords like nobody's business with this thing. It comes in like a wrecking ball, and it will clear the center with one swing. That is something it is very good at doing. I'll be honest, this longsword isn't really my cup of tea, but that's kind of why I wanted to get it. I have spent a decade fencing with short, nimble little longswords that I really like, but I haven't spent a whole lot of time working with bigger, heavier weight swords. I wanted to experience using that bigger sword, and I wanted to add it to my repertoire. Variety is the spice of life. We can't overlook the handle either. It is a wood core with a leather wrap, and this is a really nice leather wrap. It gives you great traction. It sort of bridges the gap between a plain leather wrap and a cord wrap, because the leather itself has been indented or possibly stitched. I can't quite tell how they achieved this ridging, but it does provide you with a really good grip that feels nice and solid. The leather is good and hard. It's not spongy. I really don't like spongy leather grips. That always upsets me when I hold them. I like knowing exactly where the sword is, and this gives you really good tactile feedback. There's no wibbly wobbliness from softer leather here. This is really hard stuff. But this being leather, it will get chewed up by swords, so you'll probably want to keep some leather glue on hand so that you can sort of mend it back together again. I have found that it will take really well to some glue and patience. It won't necessarily restore the look quite all the way, but it will definitely restore the handling. As for the blade, Malleus prides itself on producing sword blades that are safe for sparring while retaining a lot of the characteristics of sharp blades. You're not going to get a solid steel bar. It's going to have taper and nice profiling and all the sort of sword-like qualities you'd really like to see in an actual sword, just made blunt, but not a blunt sword, if that makes sense. It still has those safety considerations that you won't get when you just try to spar with an actual blunt sword. You know, that flex is very forgiving. You have a nice rounded tip that's flared out and sturdy. No rolled tip. It's not spatulated. You might still want to put a tip on it, but it's a nice thick tip that is pretty forgiving when combined with its flex. I generally find that it's a very gentle sword to thrust people with. It is certainly capable of delivering quite the wallop, but we have to remember that a lot of those 4 pounds are centered around the hand and not in the blade. So my sparring partners found the impact force combined with simple natural restraint on my part to be well within acceptable bounds. You definitely feel it, but it's not a total bruiser. Now, the real adjacent blade geometry does come at something of a cost, because compared to chunkier, meatier fetters, this edge is a bit more fragile. It is not the sword to use if you're doing a lot of drilling and repetitive hitting on about the same spot of the blade over and over and over again. That will chew up these edges pretty bad. I've already got some fairly significant dings. You will definitely want to be mindful of these kinds of edges and getting at them with a file so that you don't propagate those into full-blown cracks that split the blade. But let's say you do split the blade, and now you have this beautiful sword down here and a broken blade up there. What's to be done? Well, Malleus has modular swords. All of their swords can be taken apart and parts replaced as needed. The fact that your sparring sword will eventually break gives a lot of pause to spending a lot of money on higher-end sparring swords. But you can do that a bit more confidently in the case of Malleus, because if you do break that blade, you can just get a new one shipped to you in isolation and just reuse those hilt components that you already bought. But the potential for modularity is also where things get kind of fun, because you can get multiple configurations of swords out of the same few components. For example, here is a Malleus Tedesca. The Tedesca is their mainline longsword, which was the basis that my custom sword was sort of spun off from. In fact, my custom sword essentially just has a Tedesca blade with an extension. Because my longsword was spun off from the Tedesca, they have a certain degree of part interchangeability, which means you could put the Tedesca crossguard on my custom sword and my custom handguard on a standard Tedesca. And what's funny is that I might actually like these crisscross swords more than either one's default configuration. With the big guard on the Tedesca, the point of balance is still about where it was on the longer blade, but in exchange, you now have a much more nimble sword that still has all that ample hand protection. And in the case of my custom blade, by losing the mass in the hand, it is cuttier than it was before, but the overall mass is now reduced, so it feels also nice and quick. It just feels like a nimble, cutting, hewing sword now, instead of a solid defensive sort of counterpuncher. This just feels like you can give really good cuts over and over, and it's not going to be very fatiguing to do so. So if it were up to me, I would maybe consider just offering 2 different blade lengths and 2 different guards rather than two separate swords or something like that. I don't know. It's just the potential handling differences between these 4 configurations of swords are just really cool and fun to play around with. And I will probably be picking up a Tedesca of my own at some point, just so I can get away with doing this. So in conclusion, while this is not the kind of sword I would usually go for, it is a very responsive rendition of one that I am happy to add to my armory. It's probably not going to be my daily driver, but when I want to explore what this kind of sword is capable of, this is definitely going to be my first pick to do it with. While this sword is not currently available for sale, if a sword of this sort of configuration would be of interest to you, make sure to contact Malleus Martialis to express your interest. With enough attention, they might put it into production. Either a rendition of what I have here, or maybe a longer blade with that Tedesca crossguard, or a Tedesca with this quad port setup. Whatever configuration speaks to you, let them know.